Test 1 2 3.
Good afternoon, all. Okay. I offer my sincere pranams to Sutur Parampara. So, I'm going to introduce Dr. Indu K. Murthy. She is a principal research scientist and head of climate, environment, and sustainability sector at the Center for Study of Science, Technology, and Policy, a policy think tank. She was formerly a consultant scientist at Indian Institute of Science (IISc) for more than 2 decades. Her major areas of research and policy advocacy include various dimensions of climate change. She is an expert for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for Greenhouse Gas Inventory Review Process, a member of the Commission on Ecosystem Management of the IUCN, and a member of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. She is contributing author to the IPCC reports and contributing lead author for Global Environmental Outlook. She is an associate editor on International Journal for Climate Change Strategies and Management and the Frontiers in Forest and Global Change, and an academic editor on the PLOS Climate Editorial Board. She has published extensively in peer reviewed journals and authored several newspaper articles and blogs. I heartily welcome you, ma'am, for this session.
So, very good afternoon, students. I hope you're not sleepy after food. I was feeling a little sleepy before coming here, of course. This is always a bad time to have a session, I understand. I'll try to keep it as interactive as possible so that it's not a one way traffic. I don't want you to be just listening to me. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to pause in between here and there, and then we can have an interaction. If you think you need to discuss something, feel free to ask any question, or if you want to bring in any observations, because SDGs and Sustainable Development Goals, I'm sure you've heard about it, or maybe you've even done projects in your school, right? I'm sure this is something each of you have been introduced to. So, a lot of the things may not be something that's extremely new. But what I'm going to try and do is, once I talk about the SDGs and the evolution, towards the end, I'm going to be talking about a bigger challenge, which is threatening to derail sustainable development. Can anybody take a guess on what I might talk about? What is the biggest problem that the world is facing today which could threaten sustainable development? Any guesses? There's nothing right or wrong. Yeah? Perfect. Climate change. Uh, in my introduction, they did say that, I do work on climate change issues, right? That's my area of expertise. So I'm going to touch upon some of the problems that climate is likely to bring in and try and connect it to uh, what you will be studying in the coming years. Are you all engineering students? All of you, right? So one might think, okay, in an engineering stream, whether you're going to be doing civil, whether you're going to be doing electronics, telecommunication, I really don't know what are the different streams, but you might be wondering, okay, how do I do? What do I do anything about climate change? If you have any doubts, I hope to kind of throw some light on why it's important to even think about climate, even from whatever stream that you are looking into. It impacts all of us in different ways. That's something we all need to understand. Secondly, in our professional spheres also, wherever we are, there is scope for integrating climate information, there is scope for integrating climate knowledge, and then trying to do whatever you're going to be doing. And I'm sure as you move forward, once you're in your third year and fourth year, by that time, you will realize that climate change is a larger problem than what it is today, and there would be a lot of demand for skilling, which needs to be integrated into what you're doing, right? So the intent is to kind of give some indication of what might be needed. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So let's begin with the definition of sustainable development itself. There are multiple definitions that are there. However, the one that's very popularly referred to is the Brundtland report, which says it is nothing but development that not just meets today's needs, but it also helps to meet the needs of a future generation without compromising, which means to say the standards that are set continue to remain so. There is no compromise on that. So that's what sustainable development is all about. Now, if you look at the UN mandate, UN system, if you look at the journey, as early as 1972, people already were talking about sustainable development. So this is not a new concept. This is not something that people are innovating. This is not something that people have found that it's very, very important to be sustainable. Not at all. Right in 1972, in the UN conference, there was a reference to sustainable development. It formally got adopted into the UN system at the Rio de Janeiro summit, which happened in 1992. And also it got integrated into the Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. There is something called CBD, there's something called UNFCCC. The entire gamut of sustainable development and climate change is full of jargons. There are hundreds and thousands of abbreviations we all use because we think everybody understands. But the truth is, they're basically talking about what does it mean for biological diversity, what does it mean for sustainable development, what does it mean for climate. At the end of the day, these are the fine interconnections that are very, very important to integrate. And then finally, of course, in 1994, it also got integrated into the UN Convention on Combating Desertification. This is to do with land degradation, and then what needs to be done to make sure that the land doesn't degrade furthermore. Right? So all of these have already integrated into the process. Now, ever since, of course, climate change has been threatening lives and livelihoods, there's been more and more talk about sustainability and sustainable development. There is a lot more focus that's come into the entire problem of sustainability itself. So, in fact, sustainable development goals have now become the mantra, right? Have you heard about something called ESG? There's a lot of news on something called ESG these days, which companies have to report on, right? So there's a lot that's happening. So businesses are also worrying about sustainability. Typically, business is about profits, right? Traditionally. But then it's no more just for profits, it also is for sustainability. It becomes very, very important to integrate sustainability into the businesses also. So be it municipalities, be it businesses, be it non-governmental organizations. For example, I represent a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization. We also to do a lot of work around sustainability. So sustainability has become the centerpiece of all the work that people do around the world. Now, just to kind of step back, let's kind of go back a little in time. Even before the SDGs came in, there was something called the Millennium Developmental Goals, right? The MDGs as they were called. Now, this was the biggest resolution of the 21st century because it brought together 191 UN member countries 22 international organizations, and they all pledged to 8 Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs in short. This was in 2015. Now, what were these goals and what did it revolve around? It basically revolved around poverty, hunger, disease, inequality, and environmental degradation, among many others, right? So you have those 8 mapped in out there. Now, this was already in existence, but then what was the need for SDGs? Something already was there. What happened? So before getting into why the need for SDGs, let's just look at what really was achieved with these Millennium Development Goals. Was it a success or a failure? It neither was a success nor was a failure. There was something that was achieved. So some of the numbers that have been reported, this is for the period between 2000 and 2015, which is a 15-year period, quite a significant timeline. It had a target of reducing poverty rates, and it achieved it. The poverty rates during this period did fall from 1.9 billion to 736 million. So which was quite a interesting change that did happen. Likewise, primary school enrollment for girls, there was an improvement. For every 100 boys who enrolled, the numbers increased over that period of time. Similarly, mortality rate decreased, HIV infections decreased, malaria deaths were prevented, and of course, globally, more access to improved sanitation and clean drinking water happened during this particular period. But still, people felt the MDGs were not really sufficient. Now, why this happened was it did seem like an optimistic blueprint, but it didn't have very tangible, measurable outputs and outcomes that were coming out of it. People were not able to really clearly say that, yes, this has been achieved to this extent, and this is where the problem is, and if we do this, we will be able to achieve more. So that was something they could not really emerge using these goals. So which is why the Sustainable Development Goals came into being. And in 2015, the blueprint again was declared, and then 193 countries this time signed up for the SDGs. And the timeline is this has to be achieved. The targets have to be achieved by 2030. 2030 is not very far. We are just 7 years behind. So there is a lot still that needs to be achieved, but there is some movement. Now, what is this SDG and what are the different goals? There are 17 different goals when you look at this, and these encompass broadly, if you look at, there are 3 pillars of sustainability under which these goals do fall. Now, what are these 3 pillars? One is social development, the second is economic development, and the third is environmental protection, right? So you have the environment, you have the social or the people, and you also have the economics. All of these 3 integrated when you're looking at the sustainable development goals. Now, these have been further divided into 5 different thematic areas, something to do with people, prosperity, peace, partnership, and planet. Now, just to make things easier for you, the way you can probably think is, think of a typical wedding cake, right? A 3-tiered wedding cake. I'm sure all of you might have attended these days, of course, whether, irrespective of whichever caste we belong to, whether it's an engagement party, whether it's a marriage party, cake is an integral part of all our celebrations. Birthdays, weddings, everywhere, right? We all integrate it, right? So now think of a beautiful 3-layered wedding cake. Think of any flavor you want for the bottom layer. I'm not sure you had your dessert, so imagine you're having the dessert now, post lunch. Chocolate, how many for chocolate here? Very few? I'm surprised. Okay, how many for red velvet? Okay, so I think we'll go by chocolate because we had more hands coming up there. So you have a chocolate layer. On top of it, what layer do you want? What flavor is the most preferred one? Over chocolate. Yeah? Sorry, louder. I can't hear. Sorry? Okay, whatever you want, imagine that. Okay? And then, of course, on the 3rd layer is another layer. It could be your fruits and nuts that are sprinkled out there. Right? Here is your 3-layered wedding cake. Now, don't imagine yourself being in the wedding. Please come back in time. You still have some more time to get there. So now the bottommost layer is the biosphere. Now, this is the natural system on which we are all dependent on. Whether you're talking about air, whether you're talking about water, whether you're talking about the soil on which you grow the trees, right? Everything is there in the bottommost layer. Now, this is the largest layer on which the entire world is depending on. Now, on these natural resources are people who are dependent. Now, believe me, in India, we have a lot of climate sensitive sectors. We have a large population which is dependent on these natural resources sectors. Agriculture is the most dominant in India, right? That's one of the most dominant occupations. Then you have forest dependent communities. There again, it's a natural resource out there. You have fisheries. There again, it's water, again a natural resource. So you have a society which is dependent on the natural resources. So there are 4 goals of the SDGs which are pertinent to the natural resource, which is your biosphere related. Okay. The next layer of society is the dependence. So you're talking about hunger, you're talking about poverty alleviation, you're talking about water availability, life on earth, and so on and so forth, right? And the last layer is economy. Now, the economy is dependent on how the people use the lowermost layer, right? So that's why this is a very integrated way of looking at the SDGs. They're all finely interconnected. So you can't achieve economic development if you do not have social capital, and if you do not have the natural capital, obviously we are losing something in the entire race to development, which is why it becomes very, very important to look at this problem in its entirety or understand the SDGs and understand that these are all interconnected. They may seem like independent goals, but they're very clearly interconnected. Now, why are these SDGs important? Primarily because it does encourage social mobilization. It can create peer pressure amongst political leaders. Now, SDG is a global goal and every country measures it. So obviously there is political pressure on how do you perform out there. And of course, it can spur networks of expertise, people coming together and trying to kind of achieve that development that's very badly needed. So in this context, it becomes very, very important to look and discuss and achieve the sustainable development goals. Now, if you look at the goals, if you look at things like, for example, look at goal number 15, which says life on land. It's a very fluffy statement. What do we mean by life on land? You and I are also life on land, right? There are hundreds of other things, or rather millions of other things that exist on land. So, which is why this is very less tangible. It's very hard to talk about, okay, what is it that we mean by life on land? So which is exactly why they came up with a set of goals and targets, and there was an adjustment that was done in 2017. Remember, 2015 the SDGs came into being and they added 169 specific targets. Now each of these goals will have multiple targets to be achieved, which makes it measurable, which makes it something that people can actually put together as numbers and say, yes, this was my base case. When I started off in 2015 or 2017, whatever is your date, this is where we were. And now today, this is what we've achieved. So you're able to look at the trends. And that helps you to very clearly tell you whether you've moved upward, downward, or you've just stayed where you are. And which is exactly what happens when you start looking at all these different things. Now, just reiterating the fact that SDGs are interconnected, I'm just going to take 2 case studies from different parts of the world to just help you demonstrate how governments have been looking at the interconnectedness. Now, let's look at gender equality. Now, this is the case of rural Lebanon. So, what did they actually do here? They installed solar powered street lights. Now, at the outset, installation of solar powered street lights is basically a better way of managing your societies, right? That's there. It doesn't seem, I mean, where is the gender connect? Do you see a clear gender connect? Anybody? Yes or no? No, right? So let's see how there is a gender connect. Now, when they install solar powered street lights, there were no street lights before. That's the base case. Now, lights stay on all night so that women feel safer walking home late. So, which actually encourage many women to take up jobs which help them, or rather which had them stay over a certain period of time. Otherwise, women were not able to take up certain kinds of jobs, right? So that kind of empowered them to continue what they were doing. Secondly, the ripple effect was that there was extended hours of activity outside home. So women engaged in jobs, there is job creation, there is an economy that revolves around it, right? So there is something that's generated out of it, and as a result, it kind of generates a certain economy around it. Now, it also encouraged people to improve their educational status because it gave an opportunity for women to take up night classes, which was not happening earlier. It might be hard for a lot of you to imagine this kind of a situation, but this is the reality in many parts of the world. There is still a problem with respect to people stepping out in certain localities. There is a problem with respect to light availability. There's a problem with respect to women going out and seeking education or jobs after a certain hours in that. So new job opportunities. So ultimately what came out of it was that the program that actually addresses inequalities is actually helping everyone. Now you're addressing inequality because access to job was limited to only the certain gender, right? Till the street lights became operational. Now the access became improved even for the other gender. So which is what, the more the citizens were able to work, larger was the economy. So increasing jobs, gender equality, right? Improved economy. These are three different goals if you look at the SDGs. But one's action was able to relate, or rather able to achieve all of these in totality. Likewise, let's look at the case of Peru where it's about garbage management. Now, waste management, at least in Bangalore, it's a huge problem. How is it in Mysore? Yeah? I want some answers, otherwise, I'm going to sleep. Yeah, not as bad as Bangalore. I really hope you don't let it come to the stage of Bangalore also. Just ensure that you do your bit and make sure it doesn't become that huge a problem. So what happened in Peru is that in 2018, the Peru government environment ministry, the waste management sits with the environment ministry. So what did they do is they set up teams of volunteers who promoted recycling. Now this is something that happens even in India. There are NGOs who, like Sahas is an NGO which promotes a lot on waste segregation and then waste management within Bangalore and many other parts of India as well. So likewise, they set up teams of volunteers who promoted recycling through grassroots initiatives. For example, they would go and knock on the doors and then encourage people to segregate. So ultimately, what they did is they reduced the amount of waste that was reaching the landfill, right? Now, next, what they also did is they also pulled in volunteers, mostly women here, from backward, when I say backward, economically backward communities, and they were involved in sorting the trash, and also they separated the recyclable material in the landfills, and what they did is they made crafts out of that. There's a group called something called Upcycle. Is anyone aware of Upcycle? This is within India. So what they actually do is, this is a Chennai based organization. So Upcycle basically works with waste rag pickers, and they help in segregating the waste, and they make lovely arts and crafts bags and stuff like that from textiles that they pull out from these waste material, and they sell it at a certain price. Now this happens even in India. This is just for your information, but if you want you can just Google and see what Upcycle does. Now they did something similar, and what happened at the end of the day is that through this program they addressed the problem of expanding landfills because they reduced the waste that was going into the landfill in the first place. Secondly, there is methane emissions that happens when landfill burning happens, right? Now methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. When you talk about climate change, we do talk about methane as one of the clear important, significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions or climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it. All right. Now, they were able to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. Now, that is SDG 13, which is climate action. Okay. So, that's one component. The second is they were able to promote progress of a host of other SDGs, including gender equality, because they brought women into the fold, they created job opportunities, they were able to create work opportunities. Job creation is another SDG. Responsible consumption and production, that's another SDG in itself. And finally, reduction in poverty also was something that they were able to promote. So, one single activity, multiple SDGs that could be addressed. So, it very clearly shows that this is very interconnected. Whatever you do in one has implications for the other. So that was the intent behind me giving these case studies up here. You want to look up for more case studies? I have the link here. I'll be leaving the presentation here with the organizers. If anyone is very interested in knowing more about this, please reach out to the concerned faculty. Take a copy of the presentation, look up for links, and then try and see what you would want to understand more. All right? So next is moving on. Now we talked about SDGs, what it means, how it's interconnected, but how do they actually score, right? Globally, this is done. So what they do is they look at the trends at a global level. Now what you see here is between 2010 and 2021, how has the SDG been, the scorecard has been. What you see is that it's been an improvement. Well, this is a world average. There's been an improvement in the scores, which means to say countries around the world have been doing their bit. How much each is doing is different, but in general, the trends are okay. But then global picture is never sufficient. Each country needs to know what's happening within their own country to take stock and do what needs to be done. So coming zoom down to India. So India also puts together the SDG index scorecard, as we call it, right? Now, this is the kind of average performance. It's not a very good story. We rank 121 out of 163. Not good, right? This is not a high score performance. We are talking about a rank amongst 163 countries. So, and what you see, like I said, are different arrows that you see. Some are upward, some are just parallel, some are going downward. So we are performing worse than what we were in some places. We are going down in some places where you see a gray dot is because there's no data. Now data is another problem. So given that there is a need for a lot of information that needs to flow from one to another. Now the interesting thing is that India has been doing quite a bit on this front, be it SDGs, be it other things. One of the missions that the Prime Minister announced in the Conference of Parties, or COP, as you may have read in the newspapers, in the 26th Conference of Parties, was something called the Life Mission. This is all about conscious production, conscious consumption, being sustainable in the way we live. That's what this entire life mission by the government of India is all about. In fact, the recently ended G20 summit at New Delhi had a lot of focus on the life mission also. There's a lot that's being talked about in this place also. Now, again, from India, one would also want to know, okay, how is my state doing, right? Now, here is a scorecard for all the various different states of India and how they are performing. And as you see here, you see more reds. Don't bother about the numbers. Don't really bother about where what is happening. There are quite a few reds, significant number of reds. Green is where things are okay. Quite a few yellow, it's a performer, but it can still do better, right? And then, of course, reds are the ones aspiring to be better than what they are or where they are today. And of course, the blue is an achiever. You do see a few blues here, right? Chandigarh, you find for SDG 6, I think it's blue, which means they've achieved quite a bit, or they've achieved their benchmarks, what they aspire to, right? So that's the way this ranks. So there are ways to measure this. This is what I wanted to kind of demonstrate. But then just measuring in a single point in time is not really enough. Now, this applies even your scorecards, right? Whenever your marks are get, you can look at it today. You always try to see how much did I get compared to my previous test, examination, or whatever. It's never like, okay, this time I got so much, I'm happy. No, you always try to compare and see, am I better than where I was? If I've strived very hard to improve my scores, I always want to see where I am today as compared to where I was yesterday. It's a different issue that sometimes crazily we also end up comparing with the next person, but that's not really the best way. But comparing it with your own scores is the real way to look at how you're performing as compared to where you were there. That's the trend graph. Now, the trends become very, very important, and that's what I meant when I talked about, whether you're going upward, whether you're where you are. Sometimes consistency matters, but many a time improvement is what counts, right? If you're not able to, for some reason, let's say, for me mathematics was not my favorite subject. I used to get a decent score, but I never strived to improve my score because I was very clear that I didn't want to do anything with math after my 12th standard. That was my choice. You people are all here because you do like math, I hope. I really hope so. So given that, all I try to do is maintain my scores. I never wanted to get a centum. 100 ಬೇಕು ನನ್ಗೇನು ನಾನು ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಅನ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಂದ್ರೆ okay chalo, it happened, that's it. But the point is, so there are certain aspirations which can be met, but they have to be realistic. Now, if you have real life problems in a state where, see, there is only so much resource that can be allocated within a state for solving issues around everything related to people as well as resources. Now, for instance, the state will have to prioritize. Is poverty alleviation the biggest thing that it wants to put in money for, or is waste segregation the biggest thing? Now it will have to make a decision. It can't say I will achieve 100% in everything. It can't. Over a period of time it might be possible, but in reality it has to happen in a phased manner, which is why it's always good to look at how you're performing as compared to your previous. And this is what the trend lines actually indicate. I'm sure as you go deeper into your studies, you will be looking more into why it matters to look at the trends rather than static numbers. Static numbers speak volumes, but in real life, trends is what matters when you're looking at large data sets. Now, this is again a ranking for India. I will not get into the details of this yet again. Now, moving forward, let's look at the biggest problem that somebody pointed out very rightly, climate change, and why in the context of sustainable development, it becomes extremely important to be worried about this problem. Now, what does science say with respect to the problem of climate change? What you see here are numbers from for people working in the climate space, for people like me, for scientists like me, this is like a Bible. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. That's the popular acronym that's used. Now, they produce reports from time to time, which pulls in together all the existing science published from around the world on various different things with respect to the physical environment, which is to do with the climate system, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, everything. It also brings in information on what are the climate impacts, how are people adapting, and there is a third volume which is called mitigation, which is to do with what are people doing to address the problem, to cut down emissions, right? So now what does this say? In a nutshell, it just summarizes that the carbon dioxide concentration on the Earth's surface is the highest in at least 2 million years. It's never hit this high at any point in time. Secondly, sea level rise is increasing. The increase in the sea level is the fastest in at least 3,000 years. Arctic sea ice, it's melting very fast. So the extent of the Arctic sea ice is kind of reducing over time, and it is at the lowest level in at least 1,000 years. And of course, glaciers are retreating unprecedented in at least 2,000 years. Now, the timelines that you see are very long timelines, right? So please remember, just one thing that I always want to point out to every audience is that weather and climate are very different. Okay, there's a very fine difference between weather and climate. Although a lot of us use it interchangeably, they don't mean the same. Now, weather is, okay, last year, right? This time in September, it was rainy. But this year, it's quite hot, right? Now, year to year variation, season to season variations is weather. It was a rainy day. Today, it's a sunny day. That's weather. When you talk about climate, it's a minimum of a 30-year average. Minimum. Okay, we need to, so which comes back to the trends story. Is the trend increasing or is the trend decreasing? That is what makes it climate or climate change. Just year to year variation or 5 years, okay, 5 years back, at this point in time in the year, the temperature was only 32 degrees. Now, in the past 5 years, it's been 39 degrees, so climate change has happened. No, that's the natural variability of the system. So, for a climate scientist to declare that there has been a change in the climate, it has to be a minimum of a 30-year average. Okay, so please, this is something you can put it at the back of your hard disk, pull it out whenever you want to use it in some context, but remember this always. Now, the timelines that you're looking at is extremely long timelines that we are talking about. So basically, because they have been what they call as climate naysayers, which means, who are skeptical about the problem of climate change, saying, no, climate change is not a reality. It's a natural variability. It'll find its own course. Why are we even worrying about it? There have been a lot of arguments. But then there is enough science today which very clearly establishes that yes, it is a reality. It is not a natural thing anymore, and there are very clear science and evidence that have been generated which clearly says that climate change is because of human activities, which is why it is called anthropogenic climate change or human induced, right? So that's why climate change is, so if we are the cause of the problem, so obviously we can find a solution, right? We are pretty much innovative in the way we find solution. So obviously there are ways to do it. So this is exactly why climate change, the fear is that it will derail development, right? So which is why if you are looking at sustainable development, you can't ignore climate. You will have to integrate it into what you are doing in whatever spheres you are doing. Now the problem is we have more and more records set year after year. Every year, every June, every July is hotter than the previous, whatever, 150 years, 200 years. You have these headlines coming in all the newspapers these days. Every decade is hotter than the last. Every year is a global, record year. So, and interestingly, 10 of the hottest global years, this is slightly dated. You can include last year also into this graph, which doesn't have it. Even you people have seen the hottest years, right? You are the youngest here in this room, all of you here. Even you have been witness to the hottest years on the earth, which in itself is a huge change that has happened. And secondly, 5 of the warmest years on record since 1901 in India, as you see, is between 2009 to 2022. It's a lot that's been happening with the climate system. Now, this obviously has impact on water resources. Remember, there is an SDG goal which talks about water. So, if climate is going to impact the water resources, obviously your SDG goal is also going to be, or rather, let's forget about the goals. Let's even talk about water for irrigation, which produces the food that you and I eat, right? And also remember, in India, agriculture till date, 50% is rain-fed agriculture, which means well, if there is a timely rain, there is production. Otherwise, there is no clear cropping pattern that emerges. If you come down to Karnataka, 70% is rain-fed agriculture. So, which means to say you don't have a systematic or a proper rainfall distribution, then there is a problem. Now, okay, what do you think the rainfall patterns are now? Some observation about rains uh, of late. Is there something that comes to your mind the minute we talk about rain? How it is distributed these days? Anybody in the audience? Anyone? No? Anybody from North Karnataka in this audience? Yes. Where are you from? ಧಾರವಾಡ ಧಾರವಾಡ ಇನ್ನೂ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಮೇಲಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ರೆ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿರೋದು ಬಟ್ ನೋ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಓಕೆ ಧಾರವಾಡ ಇಸ್ ಮೋರ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದ ಪ್ಲೇನ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ಮೀ ಬಟ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಫೈನ್ ಸೊ ನೀವು ಯು ಸ್ಟಡಿಡ್ ಇನ್ ಧಾರವಾಡ ಇಲ್ಲ ನೇಟಿವ್ ಇಸ್ ಧಾರವಾಡ ಎನಿಬಡಿ ಹೂಸ್ ಕಮ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಎನಿ ಆಫ್ ದ ನಾರ್ತ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಡಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ವಾ ರಾಯಚೂರು ಓಕೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಮಳೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಡು ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಎನಿ ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ there is no proper rain. What do you mean by proper?
Time to time. This time there should be rain.
Correct.
But there is no rain in fields. There is no. The plant should be this much right now.
Correct.
Nowadays that is not taking place.
Correct. And but you do get. But if you look at the year average, you would have gotten rain that you should have got in a year, right? If for example 150 mm ಬರಬೇಕು ಅಂದ್ರೆ 150 mm ವರ್ಷದ average ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ you get 150 mm. But it is not happening in a clear distribution. So what are we seeing? You're seeing extreme rainfall events. You have buckets of rainfall, right? You one dinadalli you have 70 mm falling. Rest 2-3 weeks no rain, and then there is another rain, right? So that is the problem with distribution. Thank you so much. So the problem with climate change is that there is an increase in the extreme rainfall events. When I say extreme, it's not necessarily very heavy rainfall. There is a heavy rainfall, there is also a drought, right? So which is why it is a cause of concern. That's what happens with water resources. There is drying up of water bodies or there is more water. We've been reading about floods more and more this year. Indiadalle ಓದ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ, but all across the world we are reading about high temperatures, heat waves, flooding events, forest fires, drought, you name it, everything is happening in one shot. You just have to look at a snapshot of a day and it's happening across the world, everywhere. Now, also let's remember that climate change is a global problem. It's not about, okay, ನಾವೇನೋ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವು ಅವ್ರಿಗೇನೋ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, how does it make a difference? No, it's not anymore. It's a very interconnected world at the end of the day. Think of the Ukraine war, for instance. It did have some implications in India also with respect to prices of certain commodities. Yes, that's the way it is. So war is, it's a man-made thing, but at the same time, the biggest fear in climate change, what people fear is that there could be civil wars because of shortage of water and food. That is an extreme case, but it could be a reality. It impacts every single person. Now, even sea level rise, for example, our closest neighbor is Bangladesh, right? We already have a lot of migration from Bangladesh. Yes or no? Yes. Now, think of a situation in future when the sea level increases so much or there's so much of flooding that the land gets inundated. When I say land, the land where people live as well as their agricultural land gets inundated, and it's not temporary. It's gone for good. So obviously there's going to be mass migration, and the obvious choice of place is going to be the nearest neighbor like India. Now, when you're talking about sustainable development, you're talking about a country, but it's also the case that, because of many reasons, India will not shut its doors to its neighbor who is coming for help. Right? Now you need to feed more mouths. You need to supply water for more people. They may not be Indian citizens, but at the same time, you have to apportion whatever resource you have to more number of people. Now, your sustainable development goes for a toss. You have some targets, keeping in mind certain populations. but then there is an additional population that comes in, then there is a problem, right? So which is why you need to be conscious of the changing world in whatever you do, and then try and see how do you integrate it into the planning system. Now moving on, it also impacts agriculture. I've already spoken about. It's not just because of untimely rainfall, not because it doesn't happen at a certain time when sowing has to happen. Athwa the crop is ready for harvest, there is a huge downpour, your crop is completely decaying. Athwa hailstones in northern Karnataka. Nobody thought it can happen in northern Karnataka. Hailstone will completely spoil the crop. It goes a waste. So all of these are impacts on agriculture. Now likewise, think about pleasures of life. Let's again come back to the desserts or the beverages. Tea, coffee time, right? Now your tea and coffee, the flavors of tea and coffee could also be impacted because of climate change. Because see, all of these are shade loving crops. They have certain requirements of moisture, certain temperature requirements. Soil conditions need to be in a certain manner. When these change, the flavor of everything changes. Now this could also be impacted. And even banana, that's like a lifesaver for many people who get up very late in the morning and have to rush to class. At least ಬಾಳೆಹಣ್ಣಾರು ತಿನ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗು. Correct? ಹೇಳ್ತಾರಾ ಅಮ್ಮ? I say it to my daughter who's just getting into college like you people. So which is, even that could be impacted, right? So tea, coffee, and now this impact is not just because of climate change. It's a combined problem here. Now I say it's a combined problem because we know that we are disturbing natural habitats. There is land degradation that's happening. Now when the habitats are disturbed, what happens is pollinators are getting impacted. Bees are pollinators, right? PCMB ಮಾಡಿರೋರು ಇದ್ದೀರಾ ಅಲ್ವಾ? People in this group? Okay. So you're not very far from school. I'm sure you remember your biology. So pollinators are key to productivity. There is no food if there is no pollination. Agree? Yes? Now, the pollinator population has been very clearly shown to be impacted because of climate change. Now, climate change is just one reason, but the other problem is more because of habitat loss, right? Now, I can quote a very clear example that I saw with my own eyes. I spent 3 years in North Kannada district, Uttara Kannada, Sirsi. Okay, I lived in Sirsi for 3 years, and I used to do field work in the Western Ghats. Pashchima Ghatta, the forest of Western Ghats was where I used to do a lot of work. Now, what happened was, there was a time in time, this was I think 2009, 2010 ನಲ್ಲಿ, there was a sudden boom in farmers producing, that's an Areca belt. Adake ಬೆಳೀತಾರೆ. Areca farmers are there. Now, along with Areca, people also grow banana, cardamom, pepper, and a whole lot of other spices. Now, suddenly in 2009 and 10, almost every farmer started growing vanilla. Anybody from North Kannada here? No. Okay. So they started growing vanilla pods. Vanilla produce ಮಾಡಕ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. Does anyone know about sexual reproduction in vanilla plants, that particular species? The male and the female plants are different, okay, in that particular thing. So obviously pollination is through a pollinator. It can't happen on its own, right? The male flower and the female flower are different. So obviously the pollination is via a media. Now bees are the pollinators there. So 2009-10 ನಲ್ಲಿ there was a huge production. Every other farmer was producing vanilla. And then suddenly there was a slump in the production around 2012 end and 2013 ನಲ್ಲಿ. Now when I went and I was working there, so I ended up talking to many farmers. So I was talking to them and they said, "Illa madam, pods produce ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ." Why? Bee population illa. So I have seen people, farmers, going with bees and bee boxes, flower to flower pollinating. Literally. ಒಂದು ಹೂವಿಂದ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೂಗೆ. They move from one plant to another and they are actually pollinating it. They're collecting pollen from one flower and moving to the other to pollinate. Now, this is an extreme case. Even in the Himalayan region, people have had enough incidences of such things happening. So that is the biggest threat for food production when you are looking at climate change as a issue. It does impact you and me. No food means bad news for each of us, right? And then, of course, biodiversity. I'm sure a lot of you are avid bird watchers, people who go for trekking in this group here, right? So obviously, your habitats could be impacted. Now, forests are also getting impacted. It is not visible because the gestation periods are very large. Unlike agricultural crops, it's a seasonal thing. Nalak tinglo, R tinglalli, you can see whether it is impacted and it's over. But then tree is much more sturdier. A perennial tree crop is much more sturdier. But even there, people are seeing impacts of it. There's something called tip drying and mortality of trees. There is no physical damage. There's nothing that you can see on the tree, but suddenly from the tip, the tree starts drying and dying off. Now, this is because of climate change. Changes in migration patterns, because it's the biological clock that ticks, right? For a bird to migrate, it has to get those biological signals. It's all dependent on temperature, rainfall, and other weather patterns. Now, because of those, you do see a lot of changes in these as well. And of course, on human health as well. Whether it is dengue, malaria, everything is related to climate also. Now, again, if we are wondering why that happens, is basically the breeding window changes. Now, malaria has a certain period of existence, right? Now, obviously, when there is more water in the environment, extended periods of moisture, you have more of breeding. So, which is why you have an extended period of malaria incidence as well. So, that's the reason a lot of these vertebrate pests could increase. Now, this is human health, but it also impacts livestock health also. Animal husbandry and livestock is a key component of agricultural systems in India. Even that could be impacted. Now, if you think about all these various impacts, all of these have a bearing on the sustainable development, right? Now, if you produce enough, if there is enough water, only you can produce enough. If there is enough water, you will be able to provide clean drinking water, right? Each of this has a bearing on sustainable development. Now, you are doing a lot of programs, policies, etc. as a country to improve all of these. But then one single incidence, an extreme event that happens, it could completely topple down every single thing that's been done. So, which is why it becomes very, very important to understand that climate change is quite an all-compassing problem, and it has bearing on every single stream of life that each of us are dependent on or each of us are leaning on, is something that we will need to remember. So this is all to do with people, natural environment, and so on and so forth. Does it spare infrastructure? That is very key to all of our lives and lifestyles. Then the answer is no. Climate change also has impacts on infrastructure. Heavy rain, disruption, lightning strikes, telecommunication networks completely cut off. Electricity could be cut off, right? Uh, I think it was last year or year before last, US had a heat wave and it was without electricity. A developed country like US, there was a complete blackout. This is unheard of, right? People never could imagine that something like that could happen there. But then that's the reality. It could be such an extreme case that it could have impact. So there could be disruptions to a whole lot of systems that we are dependent on. Now here comes your engineering problem. I'm sure some of you will go on to become civil engineers, maybe telecommunication, computers, electronics, whatever, right? Everything has a bearing because what you produce, for example, if you are going to say innovate some kind of machinery, if you're trying to bring in some design change in something, obviously the materials that you use need to be able to sustain or perform under different weather conditions, right? If you're getting into the chemical part of the story, obviously certain materials have certain heat tolerance. Now, beyond the point, it could start melting. Now, there is a problem there. So, which is why the design component also needs to bring in the element of integrating the climate information, whether it is temperatures, or for example, you do know that renewable energy is going big time now, right? Solar energy, electric vehicles, EVs are going big time. Now, the minute you talk about electric vehicles, the first thing that you think about is that whenever there is electricity, obviously there is a chance of a fuse, whichever part that you're talking about. Now, when you have solar panels installed, when you have high winds, and then flooding happening or heavy rains happening, there's a lot of damage to the solar panel. So people in many startups are thinking about what better materials to use for creating these solar panels. Or what coating to put on the solar panels which will not get them to rust easily, right? Lifetime, because if you increase the lifetime of the material, your consumption reduces, your recycling demand also decreases. Now there are only some materials which can be recycled. If you can recycle, there is sustainability. If you cannot recycle, you're creating waste. Now how do you manage the waste? That's again a sustainability problem, right? So there are multiple interconnected questions, which is why it's important to understand that it might seem like something that's unconnected to what you and I are individually working on, but just pause, step back, and try and think a little ahead of time. Maybe it's not very relevant today, but then maybe 5 years, 10 years down the lane, this could be a problem. Look at what the problems have been. Try and look at science. What does science say? And then try and see in your own stream, is there relevance? I'm not saying there is a possibility to integrate into everything, but it's good to pause and look at it through that particular lens. If you can integrate it, please do. All I'm saying is you're not going to be innovating anything in your classes now, but just bring in what we call as the system thinking. Remember that we live in an interconnected world. Don't think in silos. Start thinking about what synergies are there, what trade-offs could exist because of whatever solutions that you're coming with. Any solution that you come up with, remember, it has implications for something else or somebody somewhere. So that needs to be the way you would think as you move forward. So of course, there are ways to address climate change. These are my last 2-3 slides, and then we can open up for a discussion. The world has been talking about solutions for a very long time, and governments and countries around the world have been doing whatever in a limited way that they have been trying to do. So one is what we call as mitigation, the other is adaptation. Now the way mitigation is nothing but you find ways to decrease the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that go out into the atmosphere, right? Now, here there are a lot of energy efficiency technologies that are already there that are being used. There are a bunch of new innovative things that people are talking about, something like carbon capture and storage, carbon capture, utilization, and then storage. Now, if you're looking at cement industries, iron and steel industries, these are extremely heat intensive processes, whether you're producing iron and steel or cement. Now, when you're trying to produce this, the technology is already so mature that trying to bring in another new technology would take some time. People have to research, right? It can't happen overnight. Now, even if it is there, it is extremely cost inhibitive. Now, till that stage is reached, there is going to be some amount of emissions that will continue to happen in these specific sectors. Now, which is where the idea behind carbon capture and storage begins. So, rather than releasing it into the atmosphere, can we find ways of capturing at source and then trying to recycle it into a process? Right? So that is in the petrochemical industry also people are talking about carbon capture, storage and utilization, maybe plastics, right? People are finding new ways of using these emissions that come out of it and then converting them into sponges and produce and other things, right? So that's the way to look at it. Now the other is also about EV. Any thoughts on electric vehicles? Does somebody have a big question around electric vehicles? Most of the students I talk to always have one question. Does someone have a question on electric vehicles? No? Okay. Once I finish, maybe I'll prod. Yes, please.
And like we hear that electronic vehicles are very much important for sustainable development.
Hmm.
But somebody told me like it is there is no much big difference between electronic vehicles and the normal vehicles. Like, so can you please tell me how much percent difference in
What do you mean by there is no difference? In what way?
like in ways of development, ma'am?
Hmm. I'll tell you. Probably why they might have said is that, see, when you say electric vehicles, electricity in India, you can sit down. Electricity in India is predominantly thermal power in most of the states. Now that's a fossil fuel. Coal power is fossil, right? So that's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Now if your electricity comes from a thermal power plant, basically you're not making any difference, right? Maybe to some extent there could be some saving, that's it. But ideally for your electric vehicles, if it comes from a renewable power source, then the loop is closed. Then it's in reality, it becomes a very sustainable option. But there are challenges out there. The primary problem is renewables. There's the problem of what we call as intermittency. It's again climate sensitive. For solar power, you need sun. For wind power, you need wind. And that doesn't happen all across India. It is not 365 days a year. Wind speeds change, solar radiation intensity changes across the year, across the regions. So, which is why storage is the next thing that people are talking about in renewables. So, if you can store that energy when there is excess production, and if you could push it into the grid, then you will be able to balance the two. So, which is why probably someone might have said that EV versus IC engine, right? Internal combustion engine, there's no great difference. But the thing is, if you can source your power differently, then there is a difference. But yet, EV is still better than a fossil fuel, petrol or a diesel vehicle, right? The delta is very small if it is coming from your regular grid electricity. The delta would be larger if it comes from a renewable power source, right? So great. Now the other thing is also when you're talking about EV, there's also something called ethanol blending that has been talked about, right? You've heard about it. 20% ethanol blending targets India has. Now there are a lot of public transport vehicles in Bangalore that run on blended fuel, right? So they do a blending, but the problem is ethanol comes from sugarcane, right? Right? Ethanol comes from sugarcane. Now the way India planned it is there is excess of sugarcane production in India, so they said that we will divert it into into ethanol production, which gets induced into the transport system. Now, India also has been toying with the idea of increasing the blending percentage. The problem that could arise now, let's say if our aim is to just decarbonize transport sector. When I say decarbonize, it's decreasing emissions. If you're thinking only about transport sector, this policy seems like a great thing. Yes or no? Yeah, I want more yeses, please. Okay, great. Now I put another problem into the basket now. How many of you know how sugarcane is grown? Water consumption. It's a guzzler. It's a water guzzler. It requires enormous amount of water. Right? Now water as it is a problem. On top of it, you increase sugarcane production, right? You're creating another problem there. Now the other is when you increase area under sugarcane, obviously you're bringing new land under sugarcane production or you're compromising on food production. So you'll have to run for your basic food somewhere else. So that's another loop that you're creating. Now land is a scarce resource again. Now you need land for agriculture. You also need land for solar power plants as well. Solar and wind power plants also require land for installation. Now the third element is carbon sequestration. Forestry, when you grow trees, it sequesters carbon. This is your basic school photosynthesis, right? That's the only process which captures CO2. Now, when you need land for three competing demands, how do you say that this is the best solution? If you think of just transport, it seems like a great solution. The minute you bring into the basket the other things, this is what I said about thinking slightly broader, thinking long term, bringing in the systems into thinking rather than thinking in a siloed sectoral manner, right? So this is just an example. See how you can inculcate it into anything that you do. All right. So now coming back to the mitigation thing. So that's reducing emissions. Now other is adaptation. Now think of an imaginary situation where all countries in the world, all sectors of the economy will not emit even a single molecule of greenhouse gas, right? So now today I think we are somewhere around 408 or 410 parts per million. Okay, today, let's assume. And then nobody in the world does anything to increase it even by 0.1. Do you think the problem of climate change is solved? Why? Why is it not solved? Why not? Yes, please. Might decrease, but it can't be instantaneous, right? It's a cycle and it's a long-term process. Yeah. Remember the global warming potential story that you would have studied in your school textbooks? Each gas has a different global warming potential, and also it's not instantaneous, right? The reaction in the system, it's not like you emit so much amount of gases, there's going to be so much degree increase. It's not instantaneous. So this is called committed climate change. Even if you do nothing about it today, you say that we will do nothing to worsen the situation, there is going to be some level of warming that is bound to happen depending on the amount of gases that are already up there in the atmosphere. Okay, so which is why it's important to talk about how do you adapt to change, which is what the adaptation story is all about, right? And also let's also remember that whenever you do mitigation, it requires a lot of investment and it can't happen overnight. It will happen in a phased manner. So you can't wait for everything to be over for you to kind of say, okay, anyway they are doing something, let me not do anything about it, I will just wait here till it becomes better. Maybe it might be too late. You might lose out on a lot of things in the process. So which is exactly why adaptation is as important as mitigation. And there are a lot of opportunities to do both mitigation and adaptation. Just to summarize, if you're looking at climate mitigation, we are talking about phasing out of fossil fuels. We are looking at renewables. We are looking at green technologies, a whole bunch of green technologies that are there. We're talking about electric mobility. We're talking about halting deforestation because, as I said, carbon sinks are the trees. So you cut down forests, you're losing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. And then, of course, reforestation is you create new plantations. All the plantation drives that you have around the June 5th, World Environment Day. I'm sure every school, every college does that. So that also contributes positively. And of course, dietary consumptions. Diet has a huge role to play even in the climate change problem. Now, this is more for the Western countries where they consume a lot of red meat. Now, when you talk about red meat, the entire life cycle, when you see, it's not just about meat, it's about the way it is, the livestock rearing happens, to how they are fed, to the transportation that goes into it, to the cold storage. If you look at the entire life cycle, the process is extremely greenhouse gas intensive process. So which is why dietary changes is also, and it's been very clearly demonstrated that vegetarian diets like protein consumption emits much lesser because the amount of water, the amount of energy that goes into producing these is much lesser than what you actually use for producing meat. So that's the difference. It's not just about meat versus vegetarian diet. I'm not trying to say vegetarianism is the idealistic thing. It's basically a message to people who are concerned about the environment to realize that even dietary changes, however small it is, if you are consuming say 5 days a week, if you cut down to even 3 days a week, it could positively contribute to the environment, right? So that's important. And of course, curbing population growth, of course, because there's more of population, more demands. That's another way of looking at the climate mitigation problem. Adaptation strategies, of course, a lot about flood protection, a lot about wildfire resilience management, and so on and so forth. A whole bunch of things are already being practiced. It's not new science. It's just being implemented in various different ways. Not too much of money that goes into this as it. As a policy, also this is like a little gray area in all countries around the world. Now, finally, I want to end with this, that a lot of the mitigation and adaptation strategies that I put, although that was for the climate, what you see here is mapping of each of these to the sustainable development goals. Now, if you do try to solve the climate problem, you're actually addressing a lot of the SDGs also, right? So, climate change problem needn't be looked at as a separate issue in itself. It's an integrated issue which has implications for sustainable development, which is why whether you're working with energy systems, whether you're working with agriculture, forestry, or other land use kind of options that you want, whether you're even looking at urban systems, urban land use, spatial planning, or looking at district heating and cooling networks. Now, with more and more of heat waves, more increase in temperature, cooling requirements are bound to increase, right? Now, with cooling requirements increasing, obviously there is more of consumption of fossil fuels, more demand for electricity. Again, it's a loop again, right? So, which is why one needs to see how do you make these much more sustainable. So, you're actually achieving sustainable development, but you're also achieving sustainable whatever. Climate problem is also something that is addressed at the end of the day. So on the whole, this is just another few sets of indications, examples on how it can also be addressed in the transport sector, industry sector, any particular area that you are looking at, industrial processing, or whether you are looking at aviation fuels also. People are looking at biofuel use for aviation, short haul flights, domestic flights. They're experimenting with that. Of course, I'm sure you all heard about hydrogen. It's like an elephant in the room right now. Too high cost technology, still not very clear, but India has been putting in a lot of investments on hydrogen. So that seems to be the future, but we still have to wait and watch what pans out. Because storage, it's extremely combustible. Secondly, storage is a problem with hydrogen. So these are things people have been talking about, using hydrogen for freight, for trucks, transportation and other things, but then these are still pilots and experiments that are happening around the world, maybe even within India. These are some of the readings that if you want to look into in the future, please feel free to look into it. I'm going to stop here and open up the floor for any questions, any observations, or anything that you would want to bring into this session. Thank you so much.
Any questions? Anybody? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So, do you think terrace farming would be a modern day solution to food scarcity or profile problems?
It will not be a single point solution, but it could be one among the basket of solutions. Absolutely. It can also cool the buildings. So there's a dual advantage of trying to do that. Yes.
Is there any other option to lithium-ion batteries?
Sorry, lithium ion.
Is there alternative?
People are experimenting with new materials, critical minerals that they are looking into, but the science is very young, very nascent to even conclude on anything. But there is a lot of effort going into looking at other reserves, other kinds of materials that could be used.
Yeah, because I heard about aluminum-ion batteries,
Yes,
sodium-ion batteries.
absolutely, absolutely.
Personally, I wish to know about carbon capturing
Yeah.
and storage. Can you throw some light on that?
So on carbon capture and storage, there are various different ways. People use a lot of biomaterial also for that, or sometimes it's captured through pipes and cylinders, and then they're talking about storing them under seas in huge barrels. But the biggest fear there is that what if there is a leakage? So that's there. So there are multiple ways in which they're looking at biochar as another option. So it's a whole industries are already doing it.
Why is that right?
Sorry.
Why is that motive? Why is that right?
The motive is because, like I said, some of the processes there is no way they can cut down on emissions. It's impossible. The technology is still not there, or even if it's there, is extremely cost inhibitive, very expensive technologies. So obviously, to kind of try and make it zero, they can't make it zero. So they alternatively try to capture it and then recycle it into other processes. They try to do that. Any other question? Either my session went all above like this, sixers and bouncers, or I made a very good presentation that everybody understood. I'm going to think I did the latter. Yes? Okay, great. So I wish you all the very best for your next 4 years. Hope to see you at my center as interns at some point in time, hopefully, and then work with you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, one and all. Thank you. Myself Chandresh from Polymer Science and Technology Department. I am here to conclude today's session, the small vote of thanks and concluding remarks. It was very nice, ma'am. Indeed, I can say I was fortunate enough. Otherwise, we would not spend so much time to study on all different areas. And listening to expert like you, it gives a whole picture in 45 minutes or 1 hour. And not only these students, simultaneously in 5 different halls, the engineers are listening to you. Definitely, I'm sure that they would have participated well. And some students were asking, so what about all these induction programs, or what programs we do have, and what's the purpose of all those things? Probably, if you can connect these dots, you'll be able to say. So this one is on the other end, like if whole of the earth or the climate goes, then there's no scope for us to live. That's on one end. And at the other end of this whole story, it's our greedy. So we all can map that the human greed, the activities which are driven by the human greed, is causing to impact all these sustainability, climate change, and everything. And the greed can be tackled with the values which you heard in the first session today morning. So if you can connect all these different programs that have been organized under induction program, you can clearly say that if we can manage all these aspects in our life, definitely we'll all have a happy and prosperous life for ourselves and the system around. So I was very happy to listen to ma'am, when which the 17 sustainable development goals were focused, and we got some idea about that, because in the syllabus development we are asked to connect map the subjects with the 17 sustainable development goals, and this was a nice introduction for that. And these 17 goals were split on the three layers, and we saw that they were all interconnected. So I was happy too, because one of my research work given by my guide Dr. Rupas was about sustainable thing, when which we replaced the carcinogenic aromatic oil from the natural or non-aromatic oil. And I can feel proud that even these things, when we integrate over time, that has an effect. Thanks a lot, ma'am. And let us all, on the behalf of induction committee, as well as the students and university, let us all join in thanking ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I thank one and all. We'll disperse now, and again we'll join tomorrow back. Yeah, and for this group 3, we'll be joining at IS 001 and IS 002. That is the same building. Okay, on the other side of this room, there are 001 and 002 classrooms. We'll be joining there. Thank you all. Please be present by 9:45. The sessions will start at 10.